What's up, everybody? What's up, MGTOW? So in this video, I want to talk about male disposability, but I want to talk about it from a context of externalization of cost. Now, the basic theory of externalization of cost is that we're all alive, and so therefore we have to externalize some of our cost or some of our negative, attributes onto the world. Or you can't even say that it's negative. Like, for instance, I have to go to the bathroom. So when I go to the bathroom, that contributes to the amount of sewage that exists in society. So I'm externalizing my cost, but it's necessary for me to go to the bathroom, so it's not something that I can avoid. But on the other hand, I can avoid going out in the middle of the street and dropping a deuce, because that's going too far into externalizing my cost, because it's no longer rational for me to go out in the middle of the street and drop a deuce when I could easily just go to the bathroom. So we can see from this kind of theory that this theory applies in different segments of society. Like, for instance, there's the business theory of externalization of cost, where one classic example is the roads, where, for instance, your local supermarket might benefit more from using the road through profit than you do driving to and from work. Whereas the business is profiting a lot and you're paying taxes for the same road and the same amount of taxes, but they're making more money. Or, for example, if a business tells you that you have to pick up a product from their store instead of delivering it to you, they're externalizing the cost in that way too, where maybe another business might deliver it, and so you're paying more out of your own pocket to go and pick up the product. So in that sense, it's an externalization of cost. And then you can also look at it from a social aspect, like, for instance, the question of personal drug use, because, for example, personal drug use, the externalization of cost onto society may be that there's a rise in drug gangs because of your personal use. And even though your personal use is not immoral, the rise of drug gangs is bad. So therefore, there has to be some type of balance struck between finding something that you can use that's not going to cause the rise of drug gangs. And then similarly, we can look at examples of the environment. Like, for example, you might need to heat yourself, so you might need to burn some wood or some coal or some oil. But if you're going to the extreme of burning down an entire forest just for one person to heat themselves, that's kind of going beyond reason. So, again, we're humans, we need to do things and kind of destroy the environment a little bit, but within reason. Shouldn't just be doing it just because. And that's kind of what the externalization of cost theory is getting at. At least that's what I'm getting at in this context of it. So you're probably asking what this has to do with male disposability. And well, in a sense, male disposability is an externalization of cost from one male to another male, because every time one male secures a mate or multiple mates, it's excluding another male from securing a mate. In a sense, in an abstract sense. Nobody's saying that everybody gets a mate. I'm not saying that. But we can look at this chart here to kind of see more what I'm talking about. So you have the two extremes, which would either reduce or limit male disposability. One being killing 2/3 of all men, which, of course, that would leave the remaining 1/3 of men as extremely indispensable people. But that's kind of not good for the other 2/3 of men that get killed. Or you can have state-enforced monogamy, which state-enforced monogamy would guarantee the most amount of men reproductive access, but we can see that there would be a lot of negatives going along with state-enforced monogamy as well. But before I get into that, I just wanted to jump back over to killing 2/3 of all men, because this question of killing 2/3 of all men brings into question eugenics and Darwinism and all those type of things. So while it would be beneficial in a Darwinistic sense, it would definitely speed up natural selection to kill 2/3 of all men. The question of who would be killing the men and who would not be getting killed would probably come down to some type of genetic selection or some type of extreme eugenics. So that would be in a society where there is extremely high levels of IQ testing and physical testing. And if you're talking about 1/3 of all men, that would only be 33% of men would make the cut. And if we're talking about eugenics, that doesn't mean just money. That doesn't just mean you have a lot of money, because it would also be genetic testing. So if you were predisposed to genetic diseases, or, if you didn't meet certain physical requirements, then you wouldn't fall in, because this is talking about the top 33% in all categories, because that's what eugenics is about. So if you would be advocating for this, then you would be in that top 33% of both mental and physical and social mobility or upwardness. So that's a pretty small group of people that could even realistically advocate for the killing of 2/3 of all men. Now, next over, which is not as extreme as killing 2/3 of all men, would be state-enforced polygyny. Now, in this system, there would be a few men with a lot of wives and a lot of men without wives. And we know that that would lead to, increased levels of crime and increased levels of dysfunction in certain senses in society if you have so many unmarried men that have no prospect of having children, and then a small class of elite men who have all the power, all the women. Those type of societies are not beneficial for men at all. And, so again, that's kind of leaning more towards the anti-male side of things, because we can see that a small group of men is almost unrationally externalizing the cost of getting more women for them onto other men, because other men have to either be killed or live without mates and no prospect of even getting mates. So then as we move closer to the center here, I would say that this is kind of what's inside the sexual Overton window, if we're looking at this kind of politically, where you'd have socially sanctioned promiscuity. And I think that this is a good title for what we have nowadays, especially with Tinder and all the other dating apps and the social acceptability of even divorce and breakups, and you go girl, and he's not good enough for you, and you got to have a laundry list of stuff that your man has. And we can see that hookup culture and the unacknowledgement that marriage is a serious monogamous relationship could all fall into the category of socially sanctioned promiscuity. And so the thing is that socially sanctioned promiscuity looks good on paper for men, because in theory, if you're in that top 20% of men, you can have access to a lot of women, possibly even more women than in a state-enforced polygyny. But for the remaining 80% of men, the bottom 50% of men are going to have zero to very little access at all to females. And then the kind of middle 30% of men are going to be struggling very hard to find relationships, and especially committed relationships. They're going to be looks maxing and finance maxing and strength max. They're going to be trying to max out everything just to get an average or slightly below average woman. And then the top 20% of men are going to be making out like bandits. So again, this is not as good for men, because it's the top 20% is externalizing the cost. And especially with welfare and stuff like that, that's a big externalization of cost. Because when the top 20% of select quote unquote men are getting women pregnant, and then the bottom 80% of men, or more likely that 30% in the middle, are going to have to pay welfare and other social benefits to women that become impregnated by these men through socially sanctioned promiscuity. So I think also pump and dump does fall into the category of socially sanctioned promiscuity. So you can see how it's leaning towards the anti-male side, although it's still within the Overton window, the sexual Overton window of what's socially acceptable right now. It is leaning towards the anti-male side because socially sanctioned promiscuity triggers the 80-20 rule, and thereby is limiting 80% of the men's access to sex and reproduction. So while I'm not judging anybody that does pump and dump, it's increasing the amount of women that are not going to be available for monogamous relationships. So if we go right to the center, we can see that the artificial womb is there because there's no externalization of cost onto another party at all. If a man wants to have a child, he goes to the artificial womb. If a woman wants to have a child, she goes to the artificial womb, and then she doesn't have any physical risk accompanied with the pregnancy. And so this seems to be the most fair option, quote unquote fair, because there's no externalization of cost onto either party. So there's no externalization of cost. It's just the artificial womb. You use it, you get a baby. There's no externalization of cost. Nobody has to make any deals or agreements or compromises with another party. It's the center, the dead center politically within the sexual Overton window. Then when we're moving over to the right, we have socially regulated monogamy. Now, since the artificial womb does not exist yet, or is not publicly available, or may never be publicly available, socially regulated monogamy through scientific data seems to be the most beneficial setup for male-female relationships when it comes to looking at society as a whole and for the upbringing of children. It seems that a mother and a father in the home raising the child or children seems to be statistically proven to be the best way to raise children and therefore create a society of people. It's also interesting that this moving towards the right is moving towards the pro-male side, or which would be more beneficial to more men. Now, when I say socially regulated monogamy, looking at something like modern monogamy, where women have choice and selection on who they marry, but once they choose to marry, there's some social regulations that both benefit men and women, not regulations that only benefit women and no regulations that benefit men. Because men should be allowed to see their children no matter what, because this is about sexual reproduction. Marriage is about sexual reproduction and building society. It's not about women. So if it's proven statistically that it's beneficial for men, fathers, to see their children, then that should be enforced socially. It shouldn't be like, oh, I guess he was a bad guy. He can't see his kids anymore. Pay us money. And it just seems that this is the best way to do it. Socially regulated. Everybody gets to choose who they marry, but once they marry somebody, they got to do it for the kids kind of thing. And for society, it kind of sucks, but when you have monogamy, you're opening up the opportunities for more and more men to have partners and have access to reproduction. And this is within the sexual Overton window because nobody's being forced to do anything that they haven't previously agreed to. And as long as children are allowed to see their father after a divorce, then what's the big deal? So then when we move a little bit more over to the right, it's not the extreme, far extreme, But taking women's rights away would be beneficial for a lot more men, even than socially regulated monogamy, because taking women's rights away would allow for more men into the workforce. It would allow for men to have more authority over the relationship, the raising of the children. It wouldn't allow for the women to take the children at all in a divorce. And taking women's rights away would, promote, I guess, more productive society in a sense, because men would be more productive because women would not be allowed to be productive in certain senses. And there would be no added benefits for women like welfare and affirmative action and all these other things. So we would just take women's rights away, and that would be very beneficial for even more men than a socially regulated monogamy system where women had more choices to either be married or not married and things like that. So now the far extreme of pro-male is state-enforced monogamy. Now, while this might sound like a good idea on paper, and it is technically the best way to guarantee that the most amount of men are reproductively active, at the same time, taking away women's right to choose who they marry would, in a sense, take away men's right to choose who they would marry, because state-enforced monogamy, especially in this highly technological society, I think that it wouldn't look like you imagine it in a lot of ways. For example, there might not even be any sexual intercourse involved in state-enforced monogamy. It might be done either through cloning or through selected, artificial insemination with selected eggs and selected sperm. And then you just be assigned to a wife and given a child, and then you have to raise that child, but you didn't even get to do the fun part. Or alternatively, if they're doing some type of eugenic system, because how else would we assign each person a wife? We'd have to do some type of eugenics thing where it was like, okay, well, we're looking at people and matching them up to each other for certain traits and characteristics, because how else would they choose? It's not like it's going to be like a lottery and they just randomly assign you a woman and assign each person a woman. Like, no, if the state's going to enforce it, they're going to do it to the state's benefit. And that would suck for some people. Like, say, for instance, you're a really strong guy and they want to pair you with a really strong woman, and you might just get a masculine presenting lesbian, not a masculine presenting transgender lesbian, just a regular masculine presenting lesbian. And that might not work out so good for you. Or, for instance, if you're getting selected for intelligence, for different reasons, you might not get the wife of your dreams state assigned to you and that you have to live with now and raise kids with. So, taking women's rights away completely to choose would also take men's rights away to choose who they marry. And that's probably not going to be beneficial for most men. But reproductively speaking, it would be the way to provide the most access to the most amount of men. So basically, within these realistic kind of the sexual Overton window of where we're looking at things, leaning more towards the anti-male side is socially sanctioned promiscuity, which includes, Tinder dating and pump and dumps and, getting divorced a bunch of times, things like that, is anti-male, and it's also less pro-social or anti-social when compared to socially regulated monogamy, because socially regulated monogamy allows for more men to have the opportunity to access relationships and sexual reproduction, and also so that therefore makes it more pro-male in the first place, and it's also more beneficial to the children and to society. So yeah, that's really all I wanted to talk about in this video. Hopefully it kind of makes sense where I'm coming from. If you have any disagreements, let me know in the comment section. Other than that, have a good day and go MGTOW.